Hello and welcome to Politics in the Pulpit. This is a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Beth Allison-Glenny. I'm a Baptist minister and I'm working for the Baptist Union as their public issues enabler, part of the joint public issues team. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place or space on the political or preaching landscape. And today I'm very pleased to introduce the Reverend Steve Chalke, founder of Oasis and a Baptist minister.
Hi, good morning.
Morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. Politics in the pulpit. It's a provocative question, really. And I wonder a little bit what that might mean for you and your context and how you've come to be here.
Well, actually, even the title, Beth, is an interesting thing, isn't it? Politics in the pulpit. I think it's a great title because it rhymes. You know, it's two P's in there, politics and the pulpit. But the reality is, you know, the introduction of pulpits themselves were a sociological thing, weren't they? It was to say, this is the lecture hall. This is where you will come and receive wisdom from on high. And so there's all sorts of justice issues in there and all sorts of leadership issues in there. But take it, you know, we don't have a pulpit anymore. I'm sure you haven't got one, actually. But we've got this opportunity to talk about equality and inclusion and listening to one another. So I think that this is fundamental to the whole task of the church. In fact, it is the task of the church. You know, I'm sure I don't need to remind you or anyone else, but you know, these extraordinary statements that the prophets make in the Old Testament. You know, I'm not interested in your songs. Whoa, that's a bit shocking, isn't it, to a 21st century Christian song industry? I'm not interested in your songs. What I'm looking for is justice. Away with your worship, in that sense. You know, burn it. Let's do some justice. That seems to me to be the heart of the gospel.
I was remembering as I was preparing this that your book came out when I was recently a theology student called The Lost Message of Jesus Christ. And I think it was probably one of the first instances outside of a kind of classroom environment that I'd really encountered somebody doing that kind of, I guess, the sociological conversation around scripture as well. Like you were trying to say there's something in here. I mean, that's quite, you know, we've got a provocative title here, but it's also a provocative title, isn't it? The Lost Message of Jesus Christ. What do you think we're losing if we miss the kind of, in that kind of unwrapping of kind of the social side of what's going on in the Gospels, if that's the right way of putting it?
Well, I think Beth, that probably drives me back to, you know, my story, because all understanding comes out of context, doesn't it? Out of a specific context. So I'm actually mixed race, and everybody always thinks I'm the color I am now because I've been on some Mediterranean holiday or whatever, but I haven't at all. I just came out this way. So I'm an Anglo-Indian. And when I was born back in the mid 1950s, my father's black skin, because it's from South India, and my mum's from Chatham, so very fair skinned, and their mixed marriage meant that half her family never spoke to her again. I remember as a child walking up streets and people would literally, honestly, I could see them cross to the other side of the road because they saw my dad coming. I was the darkest coloured skin kid in our school. I'd now be the lightest coloured kid in that same school because London's demographic has changed so much. But I grew up with that sense of exclusion because of race, and the poverty that brought to my mum and dad and to me and my siblings as a result. So I think that this kind of justice thing became baked in. My mum and dad were never angry. I mean, they were wonderful, but I think it became baked into who I was. So even on becoming a Christian, which happened to me when I was 14 through South Norwood Baptist Church, in South London. I just lived just up the road, started going to a youth club. Even though the gospel I was taught at church through my youth group was, you know, if you were to die tonight, where would you be? If you've not said this prayer, say this prayer, this kind of eternal insurance policy. You know, it might be tough now, but you might have to listen to a whole load of sermons, but it'll pay off in the end. That was definitely the gospel that I received. I somehow knew, I don't know how, that it had to be more about that. And even the night when I decided that I wanted to follow Christ, I was walking past Crystal Palace football ground, actually, because South Norwood Baptist Church is in Holmesdale Road. It's at one end of the Palace football ground, and I lived at the other end. So I was walking effectively up the side of the ground. And I remember thinking, if I'm going to follow Jesus, when I grow up, I'm going to set up a school that's worth going to. I went to a very poor school, which was, and that was all related to my parents' poverty, etc., etc., my dad's colour. And I'm going to set up a house for kids who are never cared for. I had friends who weren't cared for. And I'm going to set up some healthcare, a hospital. So all of this came on the same night I became a Christian, even though I realize now the message I was responding to didn't contain any of those elements at all. So I think that's why my stories became important to this. And then I remember when I went to theological college, eventually, it was the era of John Stott, who was writing about contemporary issues relevant to Christians, and then Martin Lloyd-Jones, nobody will be able to remember this, saying that all evangelicals should leave the Church of England. And yeah, I wasn't in the Church of England, but I watched this going, and the debate was between, has the gospel got any justice? Is there anything social in this, or is it all about the salvation of souls? Is it a spiritual message or a social message? And the two camps were very divided. You know, those who were of the pure gospel, the evangelicals of the time, and those who were social liberals. And it struck me that as you read the gospels, people used to argue over Luke's gospel chapter 4, actually. You know, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, says Jesus. My task is to announce freedom to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, etc. And people used to argue over whether this is spiritual good news for the spiritually poor, or whether it's a much fuller bodied thing like that, and throw insults at each other. And I always used to think, well, if you just read the rest of Luke's gospel, you'd work out that it's the whole thing for Jesus. It's the whole integrated, holistic, shalomic passage and content. But nobody ever seemed to do that. So I think that's where my Christianity was born.
I remember when I made a decision personally to follow Christ, that for me it was also, it had to be about the now. It had to be about the now, because heaven seemed like such a long way away. I mean, the kind of freedom that you are with a teenager, thinking that death is something that happens, to old people. But I think I remember thinking, yeah, but it's not just about what happens when I die. It's about everything about how I live now. And that was the bit, the kind of the penny drop moment.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, you see, writing the lost message Jesus was, so here's the thing, I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but Oasis began to develop. I founded Oasis in 1985, and we began by housing young women who'd been abused. We're still doing the same project that set up. It was hard to set up, but we run it to this day in South London. It's a safe house for young women who've been abused and seen violence, and they don't believe in themselves. They're broken. And that's why we called Oasis Oasis. Actually, it's my wife's idea. She said this house should be called Oasis. Hence, we set up a charity called Oasis, and it's grown out from there. But in all of this work, I more and more came up against the theology that I was taught at theological college, which was still this, what will your eternal destiny be? And I was increasingly much more interested in, well, what's happening to people today, tonight, this week? And then I had this extraordinary experience at the beginning of Oasis. So I was already on this pathway. But years and years ago, we used to run a project called Christmas Cracker, which was a youth project in this country where loads of young people from churches got involved. And then we created money, which we worked in partnership with mission agencies around the world in. And I went out to Bangkok one year to make a video. because we were funding various projects in the red light districts in Bangkok. But one afternoon, this changed my life, I swear to you. They took me, they said, well, would you like to come and see this old hospital that's shut down? But it's where the city leaves the orphans that no one wants. You know, the girls that no one wants, because if a family had a girl before a boy, often, you know, in their poverty, they want to get rid of them, to be honest, because they needed the boy, you know, there's no old age pension, etc. You need the men to work. That was the thought, you know, you'll understand all these things. I'm not sticking up for any of it, but that's how it was. Anyway, they drove me in an old camper van, I remember, Volkswagen camper van, to this hospital, which was built for 500 patients. And as I went in, they said there are 1,500 children here. And we walked around these wards, and there were children laying 3 to a bed. I might even tell the story in the Lost Message of Jesus, I'm not sure now, but they were laying across a bed, and you get a baby, and you get a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, and they'd all be laying horizontally across these beds. And there were very few staff, and these children had no personal attention. And I walked through ward after ward, and the beds were soaked with urine, and it was just terrible. And I went into this ward, Beth. I went into this ward, and I sat, and there was this kid who was sat up on a bed with a baby beside him, and there was another child there asleep. But he was sat up and he was rocking backwards and forwards incessantly. I'm sure you've seen this kind of thing. And I've been told not to touch these children, but I sat perched on the bed as well, and I began to stroke him. And he couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand him. But he wasn't saying anything anyway, so I just stroked him. And slowly he began to stop rocking, and he came to a point of stillness and peace, and I continued to stroke him. But then I was told we had to go, and there was nothing I could do. And I got up and I left that ward, and I looked back through the little glass window, and I watched as he began rocking again. And the rocking got stronger. And the truth is, I walked out into the car park, and I sat in that camper van, and I said to God, I can't live anymore. I just can't carry on. You know, even when I think about it now, how can I carry on with my life and this stupid theology I've got that wants to get everyone to heaven and wants to condemn this kid to hell because he's not heard the good news? It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It was the biggest threat to me in abandoning my faith. I have to tell you, it just, I didn't want to even live anymore. I couldn't bear being alive. I prayed that God would just end my life. It seemed so unfair that I should return to the UK and continue living. And I think out of all of that, Beth, we've probably taken up too much time telling you this story, but I thought to myself, I have to rethink all of this theology for myself, because either I don't trust this book as I was used to referring to the Bible. I now see it as a library and a book of different texts. But either I don't trust this book at all, or I have to find some deeper truth within it. And that's what led me to the research that produced, in the end, the Lost Message of Jesus, and has produced the responses that we've had ever since.
Thank you. I think, yeah, I hear you. I think it's that real desire that this needs to not sit in the book, doesn't it? It needs to. We need to make sure that this we're doing what this salvation thing is. So you campaign on a whole lot of issues. You've been in the news this weekend. This continues to be your life's work, and that little boy has changed your life and many others since then. I wonder if there's a particular issue or a particular story, particular thing that you would want the preachers that are listening to this week to be reflecting on, and just bringing out, perhaps hearing particularly.
Yeah, well, I think this is such an amazing opportunity, Beth, for the church. You know, all this, don't waste a good crisis stuff, and we've got to not just reopen, we've got to reimagine and reset. And all of this talk about leveling up that goes on, and creating a level playing field and equality of access. I mean, the church honestly has, in my view, such an enormous opportunity. And I don't say that as some kind of Baptist preacher who would say that anyway. My job is working with government departments. Later today, I will engage with the Ministry of Justice. I will talk to the Department for Education. Later today, I'm going to appear on various news shows and radio things. I'm going to do an interview for a national newspaper. Now, I'm not saying to you, oh, I do those things. What I'm saying to you, this is where the fight is, and this gospel, this good news we have, is really relevant to what's going on in across our country, our nations at the moment. And it's just one little example. I work a lot with the health service. There's a thing called an ICS. It's an integrated care system. I don't know if that makes any sense to you or anyone listening, but there are integrated care systems right across the country. Why am I boring you with that? But I mean, this is just off the top of my head. An integrated care system is the NHS's recognition that 20%, as they would say, of our health, my health, your health, Beth, our health together, is determined by our engagement with the NHS, i.e. GPs and the hospital, but primary care and acute care. And if we've got good primary care, good GPs, and we got good hospital nearby that can help us, then that's 20% of our health covered. But the NHS themselves say that 80% of our health has got nothing whatsoever to do with the health system at all. In fact, the bosses of the NHS, with whom I work some of the time, some of the bosses, and I do quite a lot of teaching and guidance for NHS leaders across the country, they would say that 80% of our health is to do with what they call the wider determinants of health. 80% of our health has to do with where we live, our housing stock, our community, our environment, our family relationships, our wider community relationships. It has to do with our health habits, like sex and drink and smoking and exercise and diet, etc., etc., etc. And the NHS say, this is nothing to do with us. We're a sickness service that steps in when somebody needs it. We don't actually run the health service of the country. When 2 years ago, because we're just coming up for the 73rd, is it? No, it's 2 years, 3 years ago, 73rd, I can't remember, anniversary of the NHS on July the 5th, this July the 5th, so next week. But 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I was asked to speak to the NHS when they were 70. So all the leaders were there, and people say, let's keep religion out of the rest of mainstream life. Honestly, if I could show you the picture, all of the NHS leaders were gathered nationally. There'd been a service in Westminster Abbey the day before on the 4th, and then they gathered in the morning for me to give a keynote speech, and it said, Reverend Steve Chalke, keynote speech, the next 70 years. And I talk to them or pose questions about the next 70 years. I'm saying to you, what I'm saying, Beth, is the local churches, if we can just reimagine and reset what we're there for around this holistic gospel, this shalomic gospel, this good news at every level of every person's life, in communities, we're ahead. What are ICSs? They are integrated care systems. The health department's idea of creating a joined up approach to health, but they're not working. So already they're talking about something called PCNs, which is primary care networks, which is a more local group. But just yesterday, someone in the NHS was saying to me why that doesn't work, because local health GPs don't like working together and you get competition. They were saying, who can supply integrated, holistic care down on the ground and listen to people? And they're a Christian, and they then went, Steve, you'd say that was the church. Yes. I don't know, Beth, that's just one example, but we can all invest in that down in our local communities, and the opportunity is there, and the nation is hungry to find out how to level up.
Yeah, it is. Well, I was at this point, I try and listen into my JPIT colleagues' expertise and advice about what we should be hearing in the political world and just the other things that we might be missing or might be going on. And obviously, there's the big Matt Hancock story and all the questions that raises at the moment. But without wanting to edge too quickly into party politics, it's also the deadline for people to apply into the EU settlement scheme this week. And there's a big warning that there are quite a few minority ethnic groups with EU passports that are particularly likely to find themselves at risk of losing their legal status as a result. So there is, we've got guidance on the JPIT website about that, but just to be aware of that. And then both houses of parliament, once again, are going to have the debate around cuts to the international development budget, but they won't have an opportunity to vote to overturn it. There's lots of violence in the Brazilian Amazon at the moment related to a gold rush, which has led to already hard-pressed Indigenous groups facing violence. In Hong Kong, the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily was shut down last week, and one of their journalists from the paper was arrested today. The Resolution Foundation, which is a poverty think tank, are worried about the scaling back of furlough, thinking that it's too soon and it's going to push people into further poverty. And in church news, Methodist Conference meets this week and is looking at proposals that will allow same-sex marriages. So there's lots going on, both within the world and within the churches. Lots of stuff in there. So we always we've opened our metaphorical newspapers. As Spurgeon would say, let's open our Bible in our other hand, prepare our sermons. So our readings for the lectionary for this week are 2 Samuel 5, David making a covenant to become king. Mark 6, Jesus prophets in their own land and then sending people out. And then 2 Corinthians 12, which is a reflections on weakness and strength. Steve, I wonder, where would you begin in these? Which passage would jump out for you? Is there a particular thing that
you know? I read them all, Beth, and I think that all three of them are just absolutely fantastic passages. Really, I do. You know, the 2 Samuel passage, of course, is as you say, about appointed David as king, and then he begins to accumulate wealth and build his palaces, etc., etc. And you've got to read it in the context of 1 Samuel. I think it's 1 Samuel chapter 8, which is where the people go to Samuel the prophet in the first place and say, well, we don't like your sons. Nepotism doesn't work very well, so we need a king, just like all the other countries and nations have got kings. We need this king. And then Samuel warns them against this, and then in prayer has this conversation with God about all of this, about the fact that when you place power in the hands of a monarch, what slowly happens is that you lose democracy, you lose voice, and you end up in a poorer place. And in 1 Samuel 8, Samuel and God, it says, agree that the Israelite people should go ahead with their plan to get a king, but warn them that in the end they're going to plead for a different way forward. And so this kind of, the problem is with David, isn't it, is he begins as the shepherd boy. He begins with the people. He has the voice of the people. He knows them. He's involved in the battle, and he slowly retires from all of that and builds himself this palace. I've had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem and see where his palace was, and the house of Bathsheba just below that. So instead of being involved in state affairs, he's just sat round and he's got time for an affair. There you go. That resonates with what's going on this weekend, isn't it? Yeah. Your mind's on the job, but the wrong job, because you're not focused. So I would say you have to lead from within. You have to lead from within. And that is why PCNs and all the rest of it, the ICSs are struggling, because what you need is a local leader. So I'm one of the ministers of Oasis church in Waterloo, which is a Baptist church. And myself and Nathan Jones, who's the other minister, we've got much bigger staff, and they can't all live in the area because because of house prices and things like that. You're either shockingly rich to live where we are, or shockingly poor. There's no middle class. But what we have is this thing, like, you walk with the people. Every pastor knows this. You walk with the people. You shop in the same places. If I go shopping or whatever, it takes hours because of all the people that I stop and talk to. And just yesterday I was stopped and people talking about their housing issues, etc., etc. And I'm involved with the local council. We're speaking up for them. That is the genius of the church, leading from within. And that's what David forgot. So he thought you could lead while you were sat on your throne in your palace, and you easily get distracted and end up doing something else.
I was looking at it, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because there's obviously like set up is like this whole sort of Saul's got it wrong, right? Can David get it right? And so there's this whole thing about Saul's had this power over the people, but here David's going to be a shepherd, and it's going to be okay. And then immediately, and it's interesting, the lectionary edits out. He immediately marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites, and it's just like immediately, like there's this like power conflict. And there's this really bizarre bit that's edited out of here, and it's worth knowing, I think, if you're going to preach on the Old Testament passage, that it's there's this like chunk that's just been taken out, which is all about whether the how the lame and the blind could protect the city or not, and then this whole thing about David then David saying, oh, this is why they say the blind and the lame will not enter the palace, and it's just like this is like as we would read now and kind of think, well, this is a bit dodgy. And then he goes on to tell us all about his collection of wives and concubines, which is really quite an important status symbol for your king. But actually, it's already the passage is already sort of suggesting to us, well, we opened up the question of whether this was going to work. Work. And so I think I think that's really interesting.
And therefore it links really well into the other two passages, the 2 Corinthians passage, where Paul is talking about in my weakness I'm made strong. And then the gospel from Mark chapter 6, where Jesus isn't given recognition amongst his own people, but this weakness theme comes through. You're best when you're weak and you're in the struggle. I always say, when I used to be the senior pastor of Oasis Church in Waterloo, now Nathan Jones is, and I'm his assistant type of thing. But Nathan himself tells me that when he first came to the church, he'd heard all these stories about me because I'm the leader of Oasis, which is a very large organization, of course, now. And he tells me, he says on the first Sunday he came, at the end, I was packing up all the chairs and sweeping up the floor. And he's very kind. He says that's the moment he decided he was going to keep coming to the church. You say, well, of course, I'm totally unaware of this thing. But the reality is, people often say to me, oh, Steve, you're involved in leadership at all these levels. Let me tell you, they're not half as fancy as everyone thinks. It's just all a struggle. But surely you're not at Oasis Church Waterloo every Sunday. And my answer is, well, very occasionally I'm not there, but yeah, of course I'm there. Oh, well, are you preaching? I go, no, I'm not preaching. And somebody yesterday morning, I wasn't preaching. I didn't take any part in the service except to hand people out sheets as song sheets as they came out, because you can sing outside. And people all the time say to me, Beth, well, why do you still do that? And you're surely, and I do it because I know that is leadership. In we're made strong. You gotta be involved, because I think the heart of this is, you see, going back to what you said about King Saul. Saul had the power, but David, this shepherd boy, had the influence. And power and influence are different things. Herod had the power, but John the Baptist had the influence. Pilate had the power over Jesus, but Jesus had the influence. In the Old Testament, Ahab had the power, but Elijah had the influence. And I think the church ends up being shoved into positions of power. And you can understand why a state church might edit the lectionary just slightly, can't you? Because you're in there with your robes, sitting as lords, etc., etc. You've made this compromise with power. And when you compromise with power, it always keeps you quiet. That's what I find in my life, but that's not some kind of big statement I'm making about others. I realize that in places where I have power, then I have to start thinking, oh yeah, but you know, we're in alliance with these people and those people, so I can't say this and I can't say that. But if you're not in power, it sets you free to have influence.
I guess I really like the idea that if you don't have power, you have influence, or you can have influence.
Yes.
I've heard this passage preached on, this Corinthians passage preached on, in a way that I have heard, and I don't think it was intentional that I heard it this way, but I've heard it being like, therefore, you shouldn't try and be powerful. You should try and remain weak. You should accept your weakness. Weakness is a really good thing. And the whole connection with bodies and weakness, and so the thing is in there about kind of a thorn was given to me in my flesh, so you should deny your flesh, you should be a bit tortured, you should, this is a godly way of being. And you know, you should expect to be insulted and have hardships and swallow it. And I ask this question quite a lot, but I ask it because I think I have heard it a certain way, and I always therefore wary when I'm preaching that I'm not heard this way, even if I miss almost something of the gospel, because I think I guess I worry that I would be telling women, perhaps especially, but not necessarily, people who have been injured and upset and insulted and had hardships given to them, that it's okay, accept it, that's what godliness looks like, you should expect that, because and just take it on the chin, because this is what, you know, kind of, this is what Jesus wants for you. You know, this is what holiness looks like. Paul's telling you to go and be a bit tortured in your flesh. And actually what I want to say is no. No, go can find something secure and strength and healing and hope, and you know, and I guess how do we deal with this sort of passage in light of how maybe we've made it be heard in?
No, I think that's a really good point, Beth, and a really important corrective. So the reality is, I think, well, if I talk about myself in the context of my, you know, the work I do inside Oasis, but I hope for the whole church, you know, that's what I'm really concerned about. Whether Oasis survives or not, I often say now, this is a little concern to me. What really matters is the kingdom of God. You know, that's what it's about. It's the church, isn't it? So you know, at one level, you know, even this morning, I've been saying to, we got a comms team, I say, we have to get back to people quickly. The news, you know, the storyline, the news line, the media moves fast. It's no good responding, oh, in half an hour's time. We would have lost that opportunity. Get onto it. Speak out. We have to speak out. So that's about not hiding your light under a bushel and all of that ultra, oh, we're just worms. It's about being out there and being involved and speaking up. It's just, as you come to speak up, being unencumbered by, oh, we can't say that because these people will be upset, and I can't say the obvious truth here because I'll upset that person. We've got to be in the room. We've got to be bold. We've got to speak up. Don't hide your bushel under your light under the stand. Let's stand up and speak up for those who have no voice. But we're best to do that when we're unencumbered by the liaisons, which means that we have to not speak up. A difficulty for me, you know, I just relate these things to my life, is around education. You see, because people will say to me, Steve, they say to me, Steve, you know, we run 53 schools, we employ thousands of people, we have to toe the line. You know, if Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State, says Well, we can't be really sure what we're going to do about exams for next year. Well, we got to toe the line. We provide housing for refugees and asylum seekers. If Priti Patel says, well, we're thinking about outsourcing, our asylum seeker stuff so that it happens offshore. That's a news story this week. It's a terrible news story. We're thinking about offshoring asylum seekers and placing them in Africa. It's crackers. So actually, I was having a conversation. In fact, I had a drink with him last Monday night. A very senior civil servant who's responsible for asylum transformation in this country. So I invited him out for a drink. We sat down and talked about it. Now, I've got to be in that conversation able to speak the truth. I've got to be in the conversations around education in this country, able to speak the truth as I see it, not, oh, actually, we've got this deal with the Home Office to do these things, so I better keep quiet. We've got this deal and I don't want to upset Gavin Williamson because he might take away the next school that is becoming part of Oasis from us in retaliation. It's about being in the room and speaking up fearlessly about truth. I also think it's about being together as a team, isn't it? Because I'm not claiming to be an oracle on anything. We need one another, which is why we need this kind of debate all of the time in the church, so that when we speak, we're speaking as a team together.
I think one of the gifts of church, when we get it right, is that we don't speak for, we speak with, because we are the refugees, and we are the the women who've been abused, the kids who haven't had access to good enough education. We are all of those. We're not separate from it. It's not something other to us. It's us. And so we can speak and therefore when we speak to power, perhaps in other places power, like we don't have power in our churches, but when we speak to power outside of the church, then we're in this place of being able to speak with the witness of everybody else, that we're not doing it for another, and we're not othering somebody. We're saying, no, we've heard this voice within ourselves, and we want you to hear it. And this is not somebody who's not us, actually. This is us. So some of us have a bit more privilege, and we can use it, but we use it to lift up the voice within the church community.
No, absolutely. We're only bit players, aren't we? All of us. Our task is to do what we do whilst we do it, which is why these principles that are right out of these three passages are so important: to lead from within, to be on the ground, to know people, and to lead with, to do things with people, not to them or for them. If we do things for them, we disempower them. If we do things to people, well, we leave them broken. So we work with people and we lead from within, and that's what David forgot as the years went by. I think Paul, he was leading from within, wasn't he? I stick up for Paul all the time. I think he was an amazing revolutionary. I've written a book called The Lost Message of Paul. And again, that was driven, Beth, by the fact that, there's all these statements, aren't there? I prefer women to keep quiet, and et cetera, et cetera. And again, I have to think, well, as Paul wrote, knocking on for half of the New Testament, I have a friend, and she read theology at Oxford. And I announced that I was going to preach a series of sermons about Paul in our church, and she's highly intelligent, much more intelligent than me. And she said, whatever you say, Steve, I will never change my mind. Paul is just a misogynist, kind of like, well, but you see, I'm in this place, Beth, where if I believe, I have to deal with that. Do you see, like what drives me is the inclusion of everyone. Genesis chapter 1, the first page is every man, every woman is made in the image of God. This is a revolution, isn't it, that the world still not has come to terms with. So as I believe that at the core, if Paul doesn't fit with that, what am I going to do with him? You know, I can't. So this drives me to think about all of these issues. And of course, Paul was a first century Jewish thinker writing in Greek. He wasn't a 21st century, post-feminist thinker or whatever. So he is a man in his time. And that's why I think, by the way, understanding the Bible as a collection of books, a library, and there's a progression, isn't there? We say, I believe what the Bible says. Well, the Bible says quite a lot of different things about different things at different times, because some of it was written in the Middle Bronze Age and some of it was written after the Middle Bronze Age. And Jesus himself disagrees with what was written in the Bronze Age about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which wasn't actually Moses' idea. It comes, of course, out Babylonian empires at the Code of Hammurabi, who was the king of Babylon, the superpower, 500 years before Moses lived. In fact, off the point, you can go see the Code of Hammurabi in Paris when we're allowed to go there. The Louvre Gallery, you see this tablet of stone with the laws of Babylon on, and 500 years before Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a bruise for a bruise, a bone for a bone. So you see slowly moral consciousness is rising, and Moses gets hold of this and he carries it forward and creates a new equality that Hammurabi didn't have. But Jesus dismisses it altogether and he says that's just the law of retaliation. We're about restoration and forgiveness now. You've heard it said all these things, but I'm telling you, pray for those who are against you, etc., etc. So we see this rise slowly through scripture and this trajectory onwards, because, for instance, scripture doesn't deliver the knockout blow on slavery that we long for it to, or the knockout blow that on those who want to keep women out of leadership, etc. But I did this work understanding Paul in his context about driving this whole thing forward. And I think when he talks about weakness, he's not saying be weak, be weak. He's just saying I am weak. I am weak. I've spent my whole life, ever since I encountered Jesus, traveling endless miles, about 10,000 miles actually. I've been shipwrecked and beaten up, and I've been in prison. I'm knocked back and I'm not back. I am weak, but I'm relentless about this, because this justice here and now in this life matters so much. This is the good news.
So before we finish, the gospel, we'll just kind of dwell in it for a few minutes, and then we'll sign off and let everybody go and actually prepare their sermons. And I was thinking it's really there's lots of things in here I think are rich. I just think the gospel passage this week is the one I think that will compel me to preach on it. I think it's interesting that Jesus is introduced as the son of Mary. We very rarely get women's names, and the idea that your primary relationship would be with your mother and not your father suggests that it's potentially a slur actually on Jesus, isn't it? That he doesn't have there seems to be no father in the picture. What's going on there? There's a kind of a question. And similarly with the carpenter language, that kind of like, we know you're not meant to be this. If you left your economic status and your mother and gone off and done something else, there's this kind of real opening up of Jesus's weakness, isn't it? This kind of which is then the conversation that happens. People are scandalized by him. Is the word took offense. It's scandalized. People are scandalized by this because he's this carpenter. He's this he's only got mum and a load of siblings by the looks of it, and he's like, actually, what's going on here? And there's this honor is like a finite thing as well. So how dare you take more honor than is yours? You shouldn't have any honor because you are this. And there's Jesus going, well, there's no profit without honor. Now, I think as preachers, we could be tempted to see ourselves as the prophets. I say this. I could be tempted to see myself as the prophet. I'm the prophet. And maybe if you're going, preaching in an environment that is super familiar or homely to you, then that can feel like, we're not really getting this message across, or there's not a space to do this in the same way as if I was a visiting preacher somewhere else or something. But actually, I'm kind of reminded that I'm probably the hometown, right? Like, I'm not the prophet. It's Jesus as the prophet. And actually, I'm probably the person that's sort of saying, oh, well, I don't know, honor is a finite thing. And maybe, actually, how do we receive this? Is this a bit scandalous to me? And actually, I think, so I kind of want to play with some of that in there.
I think that's right, Beth. I think, Jesus is the heretic, isn't he? and which of course is why he's put to death in the end. So the Jewish system, the priests, the official system sees him as a heretic. So when you've decided someone's a heretic, when you've decided someone is of no value to you, your enemy, you find all sorts of ways at digging at them. Yeah, he hasn't really got a father. Yeah, he's just a carpenter. He's not learned. He's not this. And we do it today, don't we? We always find ways of dismissing the person who has a different view to us, rather than graciously listening to that and finding ways of working with it. So I think there's a great thing in there. And then, as I said, Jesus then sends out his disciples 2 by 2. Well, the extraordinary thing about this, that I always think, if you read Luke's gospel on this, Jesus sends out these pairs of 2, 6 of them, and then when they get back, because this occurs it's in all the synoptics, this story, so it occurs in Matthew's gospel as well. When they get back, the fullest account is in Matthew. They get back and they sit down, and Jesus says, who do people say I am? And they say, oh, some of them think you're Elijah or John the Baptist. What a great question from Jesus. He doesn't say, who do you think I am? It's like, let's get into this. When you were around in the towns, who do people think I am? And then, who do you think I am? And of course, it's Peter who speaks up. It's always Peter, isn't it? It's not going to be Thomas. So Peter speaks up and says, I think you're the Messiah. Well done, says Jesus. And I've got to go and I've got to die. And then Peter goes, no, you can't die. You're the Messiah. You're supposed to kill people, etc. And so you realize then, Beth, Jesus has sent these couples out, these teams 2 by 2, to preach the gospel of the kingdom. But when they get back, they have a big discussion, and they still haven't got it about what the gospel, the good news of the kingdom is. They're totally confused. And it's Jesus' willingness, it's back to what you said, to it's messy, isn't it? It's not neat and tidy. It's about giving people opportunity. It's about giving the other the opportunity. Oh, they're too young. They don't speak well. They don't do this well. We couldn't. But it's about encouraging them into leadership and sending them out. And in Luke's gospel, the wonderful thing, they all get back, the 2 by 2. It's obviously been a bit of a disaster, because none of them can actually explain who Jesus is and what his mission is. And then in Luke's gospel, it says, and then Jesus sent 72 others out. It's like he's relentless at giving away authority and including people and drawing them in. I find that fascinating and such a challenge to me.
I think with the Mark gospel, I think the 2 challenges that I really pull out of this, one is that he orders them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. And I think I really I find that really challenging. Where's the level of financial stability or not in being and anybody who's an apostle, even if it's for a limited amount of time of being sent out, and where should we put, I kind of want people to be financially supported. I think it's important to care for people, but then I'm also like, where are we onto 2 tunics? What's the line here?
And you're back to your questions about weakness then, aren't you? And et cetera, et cetera. What I would say just practically, and again, these are lines I am involved in many times. Last week, I remember having a conversation about that. In the life of Oasis, so in my life, we have 2 kinds of jobs going. We have the jobs that have been created as we become a settled organization. So in education, for instance, or in our housing projects, so a manager will leave and then there's a new manager's role, for instance, or a teacher will leave and there's a new teacher's role, and there's a salary and there's a pension, 2 tunics and all the rest of it, and a status and a title and a job description, and it's all there. And our HR team, our people development team look after people, and there's opportunities to continuously progress. That's great. But then there are other jobs, and that's the bit of Oasis I'm involved in, which is the frontier stuff. you know, frontier stuff we're doing now. I won't bore you with the things we're kind of working on, which are all about justice, but there's some big things we've got going, and none of the money's certain. None of the money's certain, and there isn't nothing is certain about this group of people I'm working with. I'm going to phone a guy called Martin later on, and he wants to come and work in Oasis with me, but he wants security at the same time. And he's fantastic. And I have to say, Martin, you come to the wrong bit of Oasis. You know, we're not that established stuff. We are the pioneers. We're the frontier workers. Like, who knows if we succeed or whether we fail? We're just out there in our weakness, having a go at it. And I do think that if churches are going to fulfill the role that they could fulfill in our society as we reset rather than just re-emerge, there's going to have to be a lot of that going on, you know. So the church in Waterloo, which was called Christ Church in Upton, Oasis Church. Now, I went there were 10 people in the congregation, and it was bankrupt. The church has grown. We now employ 40 staff, but that sounds such a great story, doesn't it? But it isn't the story at all. The story is of pain and weakness and no money, and like, oh, will the money come by Monday or won't it come by Monday? And will we all have jobs by the end of the month or won't we? Now, that is the reality of pioneer work, and it was pioneer work that Jesus was all about.
And I think, yeah, I think the other conversation in this, or the challenge, is this line around kind of faith and freedom. And I think because obviously there's a question of like, so Jesus doesn't do much except for laying hands on a few people and curing them, because, you know, Jesus is still free to heal people even if they haven't got faith. But there's also this bit where they kind of shake the dust off your feet. And I remember reading a commentary on this last time I preached, and I can't find it this time, but last time I preached on this passage, that somebody said, well, the tradition was there was an old tradition of shaking your feet when you return back into the Holy Land, so that you didn't bring any of the tainted, unholy soil from the Gentile kingdom back into the, you know, this, into Holy Land. And so you had to shake the dust off your feet, and that was a kind of really pious act done by really pious sort of people. But here Jesus is completely recarving territory, and it's not about anything to do with where, because seemingly they're going out around the place, and they're dealing with unclean spirits and all sorts of things. So they're clearly an unclean world. But the idea that actually it's about if you're welcomed, then the place is made holy, and if you're not welcomed, then that's when you shake the dust. And I think the idea that faith reshapes territory, that territory doesn't claim faith anymore, but that, you know, the kind of this role of when you meet welcome, when you meet kindness in that way, that's the difference. And the dust can be a testimony or not to that. And so you either take the dust of the blessing with you, or you shake off the dust of an unwelcome kind of moment. And I think that's really fascinating to me, like as like a line of where's the territorial lines drawn. So that was the other thing that really kind of made me wonder.
It's a fascinating idea to play with, and recognize that actually works out practically all of the time, doesn't it? I think it's part and parcel of this moving forward and pioneering, and always walking with a welcoming spirit yourself. But you take the blows, and you take the pushbacks, and you take the rejections, and yet you move on, driven by this same vision. You know, they say, this may be, Beth, attached to what you've been talking about or not, but the pioneers need settlers, and settlers need pioneers. the movement needs the institution, and the institution needs the movement. I'm a kind of pioneering person, who honestly, I've lived my whole life in this kind of messy front line where I honestly don't know whether the budget is coming from for next week or next month. And I'm constantly in churches I've been part of saying, let's do this, let's that. Well, it might all go wrong, or perhaps it will go wrong. But anyway, let's have a go, because so that messiness. And then if you are a pioneer, you can get used to, I've got all these people on the board, all the institutionalists, all going, sitting there, and you can come to despise them and want to shake their dust off your feet, kind of thing. But actually, in actual fact, what I've learned over the years is that a pioneer, you're making new ground, but actually you need the institution to hold on to the gains that you've made and build on them and solidify them so that it doesn't all fall away again. So the pioneer, or if you like, the movement person, needs to have huge respect for the institutional guys, the guys who sit on that diagonal or whatever it is, but the guys who are the institution guys need huge respect for the pioneers, because as sure as the pioneer will blow the whole thing up without those who he might want to, or she might want to, shake the dust off their feet of these people sometimes and move on to a better church where I'm not opposed in this way. At the same time, these people working who are more of the institutionists, the settlers rather than the pioneers, they need to respect the pioneering that goes on, because without that, the movement will die. And I think there's something of the capturing of the whole of that in the work of the church and individual churches as we move forward, because people like me will blow the church up, and those who I sometimes want to shake their dust off my feet of, I know that they implode the church, but together we do a better job.
And I think it's the thing about the household, actually. I love the idea that you stay in a house, you enter a house, stay there, make the friendships, be in the one place. And I think with both the pioneering, institutioning thing, and any campaigns work actually in politics life, I think there can be a tendency to see cause and on one person's pain and then to the others. And just especially, I think I'm the institution person at the moment, and I think the conversation I have a lot is people seeing institution as a structure and a thing and an object, and I think it's easy to think that, isn't it? It's nice to think that. That's a much more comfortable thing to think than actually to think this is a group of people with dynamics and work and ways of being and constitutions underpinning them, but actually they're people. These are people who we break bread with and share life with and hopefully love at times, but they have marriages or not, or they have kids or not, or they've got a dog or not, they've got lives, they've got stuff that they care about, they've got a hobby, but it's easy to think of them as, it's a structure. And so we're going to hate on it, and I think when you're campaigning, it's so easy to do that, because the hurt or the need or the whatever it is that drives you, and it must, it has to happen, right? We need that.
Well, they say
it makes it more. I wonder if we make it more comfortable to see other people as not quite people, but structure. We miss the idea that then we might actually be in some way complicit as well, because if they're structure and not people, then we're not at risk of becoming that.
And we like to cast ourselves in the role of the hero rather than part of the team. But as they say, that famous saying: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Really, and the older I've got, the more I realise that's absolutely true. One of the strange things about my life, it was on my 40th birthday that we actually had an Oasis board meeting, and for the first time, someone said, "Well, what would happen to Oasis if you die tonight? If you get run over by a bus?" It's always a bus. That's through the years, if you get run over by a bus. And we began doing some work with the assistants of Harvard Business School about transition and succession, etc., etc. So I spend a third of my life thinking about whether I'd be run over by a bus or not, and what would happen. But that whole process, you're exactly right. It's as I said earlier, we all bring our part to play. We're big players. We bring our part to play. And if you can see yourself as part of this team, which is strong in its diversity, that's wonderful. I think even the Bible, as I've said a couple of times now, I see the Bible as a library. It's a collection of books. It's not a book. Why is that important? Because it's a collection of books with different opinions written by different people in different times. Even if you read accounts of the same events in Kings and Chronicles, for instance, it's completely different interpretation of what's going on there. So this library of books that's been put together, it deliberately has different opinions. It clashes. There are debates in it. Nehemiah does not believe that anyone should be in Jerusalem except pure Israelites. Isaiah believes that Jerusalem should be a melting pot for all peoples. Jesus chooses to quote Isaiah, not Nehemiah, about the role of the temple, etc., etc. So all of this debate is there. Now, it leads you to one or two conclusions, either as the canon through that huge process, as people put it together and as it came together, people had not read all the clashes in these texts, which is a ridiculous view, or these books, these holy books, these sacred books are there because they present different ideas and different opinions that move on. And the very essence of our biblical text itself calls us to this debate, calls us to this gracious conversation that's got to be ongoing throughout the church, where we're listening to one another's opinions and not rejecting them, where everybody's opinion, even though we may not agree with it personally, is important because it strengthens us as we move forward.
And it's on that note that we're going to have to wrap us up today because we're way over time. But it's been absolutely brilliant to have you, Steve. Thank you very much for coming and bringing your diversity and your challenge and your really hugely helpful stories. And I think it will be a challenge to our preachers this week to think about how we help use the church to be part of building a different way of being out of this particular crisis. So thank you for your wisdom today and your time. We really appreciate it. We're going to go out with a blessing because there are many people preparing sermons and leading churches and doing various things in the political world to try and make the world a better place. So let's pray. This bit, I think you might recognize it. You quoted it earlier. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.
Amen.